The courtroom was built for judgment, but on that day, it became a lesson. When a defiant police officer stood with arrogance and mocked the president of Burkina Faso to his face, he thought he was untouchable behind his badge. But what he didn't realize was that respect is a currency more valuable than rank, and the man he belittled had earned his through fire, not favors. What followed was not revenge, but a reckoning that would echo from the gavel to the streets. Indeed, the heart of Ouagadougou, under a sky weighed down by clouds and history, the people gathered around radios and television sets as word spread like wildfire. President Ibrahim Traoré was stepping into the courtroom, not as a ruler, but as a witness. It wasn't the first time a leader had entered such halls, but this moment was different. This wasn't about power or politics. This was about principle. A young woman named Aminata, an activist, a law student, and a sister to the struggle, had been brutalized during a peaceful protest. And the man accused of violating her rights was not a stranger, but a senior police officer named Commander Issoufou Diarra. He was no ordinary man in uniform. He had connections, rank, and the arrogant smirk of someone who believed the law was a ladder he could climb without ever being judged by it. For years, people whispered about his unchecked behavior. But those whispers finally roared into action when Aminata's bruised face, captured in a viral photo, reached the president's desk. Traoré didn't send aides. He didn't issue a vague statement. He declared publicly that he would appear in court, not to control the process, but to support the truth. The moment he walked into the chamber, every seat felt tighter, every breath shorter. Dressed simply in his tan fatigues with no weapons, no medals, only the calm authority that could not be borrowed or faked, Ibrahim Traoré took his place quietly in the gallery beside Aminata's family. And that was when Commander Diarra made the mistake that would define his life. With his chest puffed under his dark blue uniform, Diarra stood before the judge, arms crossed, eyes cold. "I do not recognize the relevance of the president's presence here," he said, loud enough to echo. "This is a matter for police and court, not for parading national leaders like kings in a village square." The room froze. The silence was not emptiness, it was pressure, heavy and sharp. The judge blinked. Even the prosecutor paused. But President Traoré didn't flinch. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, watching. Not as a president, as a citizen. The judge responded carefully. "Mr. Diarra, the president is not here to influence this court. He is here as a witness and as a symbol of accountability. I advise you to respect this court's decorum." Diarra scoffed. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I answer to the law, not to optics." That was when the courtroom changed. The people watching on screens felt it too. You could almost hear the ancestors holding their breath. In that moment, Diarra believed he had won. He believed his rank, his command, his ego were shields no man could pierce. But what he didn't know was that his disrespect was not toward a man. It was toward the very soul of the country. Aminata's lawyer, a young firebrand named Madi Ouattara, rose and began to speak. "This case is not about politics. It is about abuse, about a young woman who was stomped on by the very boots that claimed to protect her." He gestured toward the defense. "And when this officer sees the president, our head of state, our commander-in-chief, sitting in humility, to honor justice, he mocks it. That alone tells you what he thinks of the rest of us." The court murmured. Diarra, face tight, whispered to his lawyer. But his posture had changed. He was sweating now, just a little. He didn't expect the president to stay. But Traoré sat through every minute of the testimony, hearing how Aminata had been arrested during a peaceful demonstration, beaten in a van, called a useless agitator, and left without medical care. Her voice, trembling but brave, carried like the drums of resistance. "I was not resisting," she said. I was reminding them of their duty, and for that they punished me." She looked at the officer, then turned to the president. "But when I saw you here today, I realized I was not alone." And the courtroom, stiff with formality, felt like it might crack open from the weight of emotion. The defense tried to twist the facts. She was disruptive, they claimed. She incited unrest. But the footage told another story. Her hands were raised. Her voice was loud, but not violent. The only chaos came when Diarra ordered her to be taken as an example. The clip played, and the room gasped when it showed him say it. "Make sure they see it. The others will shut up after this." The judge's face hardened. The trial wasn't over, but the truth had already stepped into the light. As the session ended, the judge ordered Commander Diarra to be placed under restricted movement until judgment. "You wear the uniform of this republic," the judge said. "But today, you wore it like armor to hide from accountability." Outside the courtroom, the crowd waited, not for a spectacle, but for a sign. And when President Traoré stepped out, Aminata by his side, he didn't wave. He didn't give a speech. He simply placed his hand over his heart, nodded once to the crowd, and walked on. And that image, more than the sound bites, more than the politics, became the symbol of what had happened that day. That in a small courtroom where arrogance dared to mock truth, justice stood taller. And the man in uniform who disrespected the president would soon realize that in a land shaped by resilience, the courtroom is not a place to play power games. It is where masks fall and real leaders are revealed. The news spread fast. Faster than the wind that blows dust across the Sahel, faster than drums beat during a call to war. People from every province, from Bobo Dioulasso to Dori, were talking about what had happened in that courtroom. That a police officer, known not only for his rank but for his arrogance, had dared to speak with disrespect to the sitting president of Burkina Faso, and that President Traoré had said nothing in anger, made no threats, and still sat with dignity while the law did its work. But the silence he offered was not weakness. It was the calm before the storm of accountability. As the second day of the trial began, the court was under heavier guard, not to protect the president, but to preserve the sacred process of justice from distraction or disruption. The people stood outside in the heat, holding signs not of protest, but of expectation. "Let the law speak," one banner read. Not the badge, not the rank. Inside, the energy had shifted. Commander Diarra was no longer standing with shoulders squared and chin raised. He walked into the courtroom slower, his confidence trimmed down like a tree that had lost its leaves. The defense tried a new tactic, painting Diarra as a dedicated officer caught in the heat of a chaotic day. They introduced testimony from colleagues who spoke of his years in service, his role in high-pressure assignments, his disciplinary record, clean, they claimed, until that day. But the prosecution came prepared. They revealed that Diarra's record had been cleaned, not earned. Several internal complaints had been quietly dismissed or buried under procedural errors. The courtroom stiffened as documents emerged. Audio recordings, leaked memos, redacted reports that showed a pattern. Diarra had a history of excessive force, but his superiors had shielded him like a golden sun. President Traoré, still seated, quietly with the people, never flinched. He listened, he watched, and only once did he speak. When the judge allowed a short witness statement from the president himself, the courtroom leaned forward like a single body holding its breath. Traoré stood and spoke without notes, without drama, just with the weight of truth. "I came not to be praised or protected. I came because I am not above the law, and no one in uniform should be beneath it. This case is not about me. It is about a young citizen who was brutalized. It is about a man who forgot his oath. And it is about a nation that must decide if titles are more sacred than truth. Then he turned and looked directly at Commander Diarra. When you mocked me, you did not insult a man. You insulted the dream of this country, that the powerful would be held to the same standard as the powerless. You were given a badge. You may thought it made you a god, but it made you a servant, and you forgot. That single moment broke the air like a hammer. The silence afterward was louder than applause. The judge nodded. The prosecutors rested their case. There was nothing more to prove. The people outside erupted, not in celebration, but in release. They had waited too long to hear a leader speak with that kind of honesty. Across Burkina Faso, the story took on a life of its own. Artists painted murals of Aminata standing strong, with a sun rising behind her. Radio hosts debated the future of policing, and in schools, children acted out mock trials, not of criminals, but of officers learning what justice means. Commander Diarra, once proud and defiant, now sat with his head bowed. His lawyer requested a private sentencing, citing threats and political pressure, but the judge refused. "This is a public wound," he said. "It must be cleaned in public." Before adjourning, the court allowed Aminata to speak once more. Her voice was steadier than before. "I do not want revenge," she said. "I want a country where I never have to fear my own protectors, where girls like me are not made into examples to keep others silent. I want a country where the law wears the uniform, not the other way around." The judge promised a final verdict by the next sunrise, and as the courtroom emptied, President Traoré stepped outside, surrounded not by bodyguards, but by ordinary citizens. One old woman knelt and tried to kiss his hand. He gently lifted her up and said, "Do not kneel, stand with me, always." And that image, captured by dozens of phones and cameras, became the defining moment of the entire trial. Not the gavel, not the verdict, but a leader lifting his people instead of asking to be lifted. That night, there was no sleep in the capital. People waited as if the judgment to come was a tide that would either wash away the old corruption or flood the land with more disappointment. But deep down, most already knew this was not just a case anymore. It was a turning point. And when the sun rose again, the gavel would fall not just on one man, but on a system that had hidden behind rank for too long. The sun had barely stretched its fingers across the rooftops of Ouagadougou when the people began gathering again, not out of obligation, but out of hope. The final verdict in the case of Commander Issoufou Diarra had become more than courtroom. News. It had become a question for every citizen. Can a country truly hold power accountable? In villages where radios cracked with static, old men tuned in early. In city buses and marketplace corners, the youth whispered and argued. Women prepared food but kept one ear on the broadcast. Even children, wide-eyed and curious, knew something. Big was happening. Inside the courtroom, the mood was no longer tense. It was electric. President Traoré arrived again, this time with less fanfare but more weight in the air. He took his seat like any other citizen, nodding respectfully to the judge. His presence was no longer surprising. It had become a symbol of something deeper. Commander Diarra, once confident and condescending, sat in shackles. His uniform had been replaced with a plain white shirt. His eyes darted from the crowd to the floor to the judge. No words left his mouth. His arrogance had drained away like water from a cracked pot. And then the judge began to speak. His words were slow, deliberate, like a drum beat before a storm. "This court has listened, it has watched, it has weighed the law, the evidence, and the character of the accused. Commander Diarra, you were given authority to protect, but you used it to punish. You were trained to serve, but you served yourself. And when given a chance to face the truth, you mocked not only this court, but the very symbol of the Republic." He paused, eyes piercing. "This is not punishment. For insulting the president, it is accountability for violating the people. Gasps echoed quietly. Then the verdict came. 20 years imprisonment for abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and violation of civil rights, with a mandatory public service clause to be completed upon release. Not exile, not execution, justice. Fair, public, and undeniable. Outside the courtroom, the people did not cheer wildly. They stood in respectful silence. And then a ripple of slow clapping began, not for the judge, not for revenge, but for the law, for the fact that for once, power had been humbled without bloodshed. Reporters asked President Traoré for comment, but he simply replied, "This verdict is not mine. It belongs to the people. Let it remind us all that no one is above the law, not even the law itself." And just like that, he walked away again, refusing the stage, leaving the spotlight for the nation. Over the following days, Burkina Faso changed, not with fireworks or parades, but in the quiet ways that last. Police training academies rewrote their codes of conduct. Civilians reported misconduct more boldly. A new hotline for victims of abuse was created and run independently. Aminata, once just a student with a scarred face and a silenced voice, became a national speaker on civil rights. She finished law school, joined the President's Commission on Justice Reform, and launched a women-led legal network called the Shield of the People. Murals were painted not of violence, but of healing. One near the courthouse showed a pair of scales, one side bearing a gavel, the other a uniform, and beneath it the words, "Both must serve the people, or both will fall." Even in prisons, guards began receiving ethics training. And in that same prison where Diarra now lived, his days began quietly. He read. He wrote. And eventually, he requested to meet with Aminata. She refused the first time. But on the second, she said, "Let him speak, but not to me, to the youth." So he was brought to a televised outreach program where ex-officers shared their failures. His message was clear. "I thought the badge made me untouchable, but I was wrong. The badge is only respected when the man wearing it respects the people." His voice, once proud and mocking, now trembled with the weight of what he had lost. And across the nation, people listened, not to forgive, but to understand. Burkina Faso did not become perfect. Corruption did not vanish overnight. But something irreversible had happened. A seed was planted, not of rebellion, but of accountability, not of punishment, but of process. And in that process, a new identity took root. Years later, when President Traoré completed his term and handed over power peacefully, people did not remember him only for battles or speeches. They remembered that moment in court, when he sat silently among citizens, allowed the law to speak louder than the sword, and let a disrespectful man face justice not by decree, but by due process. And in every home where parents told stories, to their children this one remained. Once, a man disrespected our president in a court, but our president let the gavel fall instead of his pride. And that's when we knew we were not a people ruled by fear. We were a people ruled by law.